you, and on the line with me, I'm so used to saying that, right here in the studio with me, sitting next to me is Charles Sauer, Libertarian economist, president of the Market Institute. MarketInstitute.org is the website. You can tweet him at Charles Sauer. That's S-A-U-E-R. Yep. Charles, so the Charles, two S's in there, Charles, and then Sauer. And MarketInstitute.org. Charles, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
It's nice to have you in the studio with us. You are a libertarian.
I am, for better, for worse. Yeah. Or
okay, so explain to me how this works. Betsy DeVos is going into Secretary of Education, and my understanding of the whole libertarian shtick on education is, and in fact, if you go back to the 1980 libertarian platform that David Koch ran on as vice president,
yep.
He said government schools are public indoctrination. There should be no role for them. If you look at the libertarian platform that Gary Johnson just ran on, it called for basically an end to compulsory public education and an end to support for schools. So basically, if you're wealthy, you get to send your kids to a good school. If you're poor, your kids may not even go to school at all. Is that the libertarian worldview?
I mean, maybe that is the point of. I mean, that's a Thom frame of the point of where libertarians might be pulling. But the libertarian worldview is, if you aren't rich enough to live in a good school district, we want to be able to give you a life vest, a boat to be able to get out. And the way that the public school system currently works is that the teacher unions come up to Capitol Hill or the local governments and tell them that they need more money and that they're overworked and underpaid and that they need more money. It's not about the kids or education. And so what we have is a school system like where I grew up. And I grew up on the Kansas City side of the suburb, but in Kansas City, Missouri, it's one of the school systems that actually failed and the government had to take over. And the reward for that is that Emmanuel Cleaver is up on Capitol Hill right now, serving as a congressman for that. But I mean, this school system failed, and it's because were they spending money on kids or making the system better? No, they were handing out money to the teachers unions to study what was going wrong with their system instead of engaging the community and picking it up. So what the libertarian solution is, let people escape and come out. You know, I'm fortunate. I live in Burke, Virginia.
Most libertarians are fortunate. That's why they're libertarians, in my opinion.
We have one of the best school systems in the country. But the people in Washington, D.C., the people where I moved from before that, in Alexandria, Virginia, same school district, Fairfax School District, not as fortunate. If those kids could have a voucher and come out to where I am, we'd be better off. And I'm for that. That
is not a libertarian program. You didn't answer my question. I mean, because the libertarian says education is not the role of government. And if education is not the role of government, then government should not be passing out vouchers. And so, we've got now, a voucherizer, Betsy DeVos, who is going to be in charge of the education department, and not just a voucherizer. I mean, she was in Michigan, just oversaw just massive changes in the educational system in Michigan. Big advocate of for-profit charter schools and government vouchers. And I would think that as a libertarian, you would say that that is government overreach. That's government subsidizing for-profit corporations, that there's no role for government in that. Isn't that called crony capitalism? I don't get why, suddenly, because the reality of the libertarian approach is that poor kids are not going to get educated, screw them, that suddenly libertarians are saying, oh, well, we'll just talk like Republicans and talk about vouchers.
So that's the reality of the libertarian solution if we go from point A to point Z in zero time. But the fact is from point A to point...
So you want to slowly get to the point where poor kids have no education.
It's the same way the Democrats and the left has slowly pushed it where the inner cities have really poor educations because
let's talk about that for a minute. If you look at the history of Jim Crow, right? After the Civil War, there was and before the 1898 when separate but equal was established in the whatchamacallit case, there was a period of 10, 15 years there where some of the southern states were actually changing and bringing giving equal rights to African Americans, opening their schools to them. There were others where they were fighting it like crazy. The federal government had to send people down, you know, all this kind of stuff. But basically it died very quickly, and Jim Crow replaced it. And the whole point of Jim Crow, and this was in the early days of public education. Horace Mann, the father of modern American public education, was traveling around the country in the 1880s. I wrote a book about this, Thom Hartmann's Complete Guide to ADHD. It's got like a whole chapter on this. I researched the crap out of this. I mean, I've read so many of Horace Mann's books and all about. He went to Massachusetts, was the first state to do this, right, to take public education in the 1880s. Yep. He went to Massachusetts, sat down with the legislators, and he said, we're going to create a public school system that is going to create good workers for the factories, that is going to create, you know, compliant people for, you know, it was not let's educate the populace. It was not a Jeffersonian let's educate people thing. And, you know, it arguably was very, very problematic. And the Jim Crow folks jumped on that and said, okay, if we're going to have public education, it has to be paid for locally. You have to have, and they used local control as the excuse. Local control, much like states' rights, was merely a phrase used by white racists back in the day for keep those poor black communities poor and black and keep them away from us. And so we have school systems around the country that are failing because they're funded by property taxes, and they're in communities where the average home value is $15,000 or $20,000, like in Detroit, or you know, $40,000 or $50,000, like in Baltimore. Whereas where you live, probably the average home value is $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, and that property tax is funding much better schools. That's a crappy way to fund education, number one, but it's intentional. It has been that way in the United States for 120 years, intentionally, to keep poor people poor, particularly black poor people in black poor neighborhoods. And the solution to that is not to say, okay, what is it, you know, what is the standard that we're paying in these neighborhoods? Let's give people a voucher.
Look, what's the way to stop this? It's to give them a voucher so that they can get out of the system. But one of the first things that one of the things that stopped in the District of Columbia was voucherizing of the students to let them go to different schools. This was a popular program in Washington, D.C., and the left stopped it. Why? Because the unions have grabbed on. I think earlier in the show you talked about the evolution of the left. This is something that they haven't evolved into. They haven't figured out that the policies that they're supporting now are crony. They only support the teachers' unions.
The teachers' unions are advocating, obviously, for public education. They're
advocating for their jobs and pocketbook.
Yeah, and that's what a union is supposed to do.
Correct.
So we can agree on that, and we can just set that aside, because the teachers' unions are not the ones who are driving this thing. This is being driven right now by the incoming Trump administration, by Betsy DeVos and these people, and we've got to figure out what we're going to do. If my own answer to my own problem that I set up, which you didn't answer, is to do what every country in Europe does, which is nationalize education. You know, you go to France, it doesn't matter what town you live in, it doesn't matter what county you live in, the schools are identical across the entire country, and they're great. You go to Denmark, you go to Norway, you go to Sweden, you go to Germany, you go to Italy, you go any of these countries, they've got very, very good public school systems because they're all paid by the federal government, and it's actually equalized. That was the original idea of creating the Department of Education back in the 50s or 60s when the thing was created. And it was, you know, let's fill in the blanks so that those poor kids in West Virginia or those poor kids in inner city Baltimore can have schools that are as good as the rich kids in the neighborhoods where Charles Sauer lives.
The way to make that better is to let those good schools actually compete against each other so they can continue growing in a faster way. Otherwise, we just have a Thom Hartmann deciding which school is the best, and that's the one we have to do.
What does competition produce?
Winners, acceleration, and innovation.
Winners and losers.
Innovation.
Are there?
Why they win? Because they're innovative.
Are there not always winners and losers in competition?
No, there's competition is a win-win thing. I mean, that's what happens.
Come on, Charles.
All right. So the people that aren't producing,
you're using D.C. as an example. I live here in D.C. I have friends who live down in, you know, where I live, whose kids are going to D.C. schools. Some of them are going to charter schools. Some of them are going to public schools. They don't seem to see a great deal of difference. You can attribute that to competition between the two. It seems to me, though, that D.C., you know, back before Citizens United and Buckley, in a way, D.C. was largely black and largely poor. And so D.C. had a crappy property tax base. And so the schools were funded by property taxes. And so then, you know, the federal government comes in, the Republicans in Congress, and they say, well, let's create some charter schools and let's toss in some money for these vouchers and things. Basically, all they did was they injected money into the system. They injected it via a private mechanism so that more people could make money. Their crony, you know, Republican crony for-profit charter school buddies could make money. But injecting money into the system, yes, improved the school. And now that D.C. is a boom town, the public schools are starting to do well, too, because, you know, the tax base is increasing, which I think makes my argument. But you know, that
it hasn't been proved. The numbers show it hasn't been proved that money in the schools actually solve the problem. And that's where the crony.
It's been proved.
No,
we had a great educational system.
Kansas City, Missouri had one of the highest per student spending rates in the country as it was failing and as the numbers were going down. D.C. has a high number as well. Part of that has to do with it's in the city, and so cost of land is expensive. But this per pupil spending doesn't equate.
The other reason why D.C. had a problem, in addition to having, you know, a large poor population, was that so much of the city is federal property and exempt from taxation. So there were no property taxes being collected for that either. But, you know, just back to the original point, because we're running out of time here, Charles. We're talking with Charles Sauer. You can tweet him at Charles Sauer, S-A-U-E-R, marketinstitute.org. If the libertarian principle, which is expressed in every libertarian platform from 1980 to 2016 that I've been able to find, is that there should be no such thing as public education. This should be entirely up to parents. And the responsibility for paying for it should be entirely up to parents. If that's the libertarian position, why don't the libertarian Republicans, the Republicans like Paul Ryan, who used to make anyway until he got called out on it, used to make all his employees read Atlas Shrugged, why don't they simply say so? Why are they less than honest? Or for that matter, why don't you simply say so?
I think that they have, and I've said where the goal for the libertarians is to get to point Z. But first, we have to go all the way there through the steps to get there. If we go to Z on any policy, my policy or your policy on healthcare or welfare, right. We have a problem wrecking the system. We have to bridge.
People have to know where Z is.
Yeah.
If they're going to go along with A, B, C, and D. Right, and this is where I think Republicans and libertarians are lying about what Z is.
I think Trump has said it. I used to work for a couple of different people, and they said it. Yeah. The libertarians are clear.
Okay.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Charles Sauer, libertarian economist, president of the Market Institute, marketinstitute.org. You can tweet him at Charles Sauer. Charles, thanks.
Thank you.
Great to have you with us. We'll be back.